She forged a dead woman's name, my mother said, loud enough for the whole visitation room to hear, and in one afternoon she turned my grandmother's funeral into a public accusation with a $6,480 paper trail attached to my name. The county had already flagged the burial permit. The funeral home had frozen the prepaid account, and by the time I walked in, half my relatives were looking at me like I had tried to steal from a coffin. Then one Tuesday morning, a woman in orthopedic shoes knocked on my apartment door and said 7 words that changed everything. I brought the original intake sheet, dear. Before I go on, please take a moment to like and subscribe, but only if you genuinely connect with this story, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is there. I always love seeing where you're all listening from. My name is Lauren Elizabeth Parker. I'm 24 years old. Now let me take you back to Fort Wayne, Indiana, on March 12, 2023. My grandmother, Evelyn Parker, still wrote checks by hand and still kept lemon candies in the same blue-cut glass bowl she had owned since the 1970s. She lived in a brick ranch house on the north side of town, near a row of sycamores that made a soft, dry rattling sound in the wind every fall. If you opened her front door in winter, it always smelled faintly like coffee, face powder, and the wool throw folded over the arm of her recliner. I was the grandchild who handled practical things for her, not because anyone appointed me, but because I was the one she trusted to read forms all the way to the bottom and explain them without making her feel old. My mother, Denise Parker, liked the performance of care. I handled the details. That difference had been sitting in our family for years, quiet and ugly. My mother preferred what looked good from a doorway. She brought glossy poinsettias at Christmas and posted photos of soup she did not make. I was the granddaughter who showed up on Tuesdays after my pharmacology lab, checked the expiration dates in Grandma's fridge, drove her to get her blood work, and sat with her when she needed someone to explain why one bill said paid and another one did not. My father, Thomas Parker, never interfered as long as everything stayed smooth. He was a man who confused calm with innocence. If my mother spoke first, he called that truth. The prepaid funeral account came up because my grandmother brought it up, the way older women often do, flatly and without ceremony. It was August 22nd, 2022. It was 91 degrees outside, and her kitchen had that late summer heat that clings to the curtains even with the fan on. She opened a manila folder and said, "I do not want your mother improvising over my dead body." Then she looked at me over her reading glasses and said, "You understand paperwork. Sit down." The account was with Northridge Funeral Home. She had paid into it for years. The total value was a little over $11,000, and after selecting specific services years earlier, there was a refund clause for any unused balance. Her instructions were simple. She wanted direct burial, a brief church service, no expensive flowers, and the unused amount split between her church food pantry and me. Not because I expected it, not because I asked, because, as she put it, "You are the one who has carried me to every fluorescent office in Allen County without ever making me feel like trouble." We reviewed every page together. Her handwriting was slow but neat. With a hard downstroke on her capital E, she signed in front of a Northridge staff member named Gloria West, a senior bookkeeper with silver hair, a navy cardigan, and the kind of careful eyes that notice where people place their hands. Gloria was in her late 60s, maybe early 70s, and she had the clipped, practical kindness of a woman who had spent decades watching families behave badly in carpeted rooms. She stapled the signature card to the intake sheet, checked Grandma's driver's license, and said, "Mrs. Parker, I tell every family the same thing. Keep one copy at home, one with your church, and one with the person who can still find a fax machine when the rest of us are gone." Grandma laughed and tapped my arm. "That's this one." That afternoon mattered later in ways none of us fully understood. Gloria had been present when the original instructions were signed. She initialed the witness line. She wrote the file number in blue ink on the top right corner and pressed the papers flat with her palm before sliding them into the folder. I can still hear the tiny metal click of her stapler. I can still see the lemon hard candy Grandma pushed toward her and the way Gloria waved it off, smiling. There are days when the smallest sounds become evidence. My grandmother died on March 10th, 2023, a Friday, at 3:14 in the morning. I was in my apartment near campus when the call came from Lutheran Hospital. My phone screen glowed white in the dark, and for one blank second I already knew. Grief has a shape before it has words. By 4 o'clock, I was driving through empty streets with my jacket on over my pajamas, the radio off, my fingers stiff around the steering wheel. At the hospital, the corridor outside her room smelled like bleach and coffee, and that dry, heated air hospitals always have after midnight. My mother was already there, standing ramrod straight beside the bed as if posture alone could make her the central mourner. My father sat with his elbows on his knees, looking at the floor. My Aunt Cheryl, my mother's younger sister, dabbed at her cheeks with a folded tissue and watched all of us the way some people watch traffic, as if they want to see where the collision starts. Cheryl had always been my mother's echo. If Denise called something disrespectful, Cheryl called it cruel. If Denise called me unstable, Cheryl called me sensitive. Every family has a person who oils the hinges on the wrong door. At 7:30 that morning, after the nurse handed over Grandma's belongings in a clear plastic bag, I told my parents I would call Northridge and start the process according to Grandma's instructions. My mother's face changed in a way I had seen before. Not anger first, calculation. She touched the strap of her purse and said, "No, I'll handle my own mother's arrangements." I said carefully, "She already chose everything. We just have to follow the file." My father looked up just long enough to say, "Lauren, not today. That is how families train you to accept theft. They rename it timing." By 8:10, while I was still in the hospital lobby trying to get coffee from a vending machine that kept rejecting my bills, my mother had called Northridge herself. I did not know that until much later. At 8:24, according to the call log I would eventually obtain, she told the receptionist there had been a forged granddaughter document and asked that no one release information to me. At 8:36, she emailed a photo of a replacement authorization page naming herself sole contact and sole recipient of any unused balance. At 9:12, she called Allen County Vital Records and said there was a family dispute about fraudulent paperwork tied to the burial permit. By noon, the machine was moving. If you have never had a lie enter an institution, I can tell you exactly how it feels. It does not arrive as drama, it arrives as procedure. A pause on the phone, a note in a file. A clerk saying, "There is a hold on this." I called Northridge from the hospital parking lot, standing beside my car under a hard, cold sky, and a young woman at the front desk told me in a careful voice that there was a question about authorization and they could not discuss the account until the file was cleared. I asked what question. She said, possible forged paperwork. I remember a city bus groaning to a stop nearby, the smell of exhaust, and my own face reflected faintly in my car window, looking much younger than 24. I went to my grandmother's house that evening to get the folder with her copies. The living room lamp was still on from the night before. Her reading glasses were on the end table beside the TV remote. The blue bowl still held 6 lemon candies. My mother was there ahead of me. So was Cheryl. They were in the dining room, sorting papers into piles. My mother held one of Grandma's folders against her chest and said, "You don't need to take anything. This has gone far enough." I asked what had gone far enough. She said, "Your fixation with money." The thing about a clean lie is how calmly it can be delivered. I told her I wanted Grandma's copies of the funeral agreement because I had been there when she signed them. Cheryl made a soft, disgusted sound and said, "This is not the time to make claims." I still remember the texture of the dining room chair under my hand and the late sun striping the table runner gold and brown. My father came in through the garage door with a grocery sack and looked from one face to another like a man arriving late to a play. He said, "Denise says Northridge found irregularities." Found as if the building itself had discovered me guilty. I did not shout. I asked for the papers. My mother said no. I asked if she had told the funeral home I forged documents. She said if the shoe fits. Then she put Grandma's folder into her tote bag. That small motion, so casual and practiced, made something cold settle in me. Grief shifted. It became task. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with a legal pad, a highlighter, and my laptop open to a blank document. The overhead light in my apartment was too harsh and buzzed faintly. I could hear my upstairs neighbor dragging a chair across the floor. I wrote down times, exact words, names, and every call I had made. I saved screenshots of the text from my mother saying, "Do not contact the funeral home again," and "This is what happens when you insert yourself." I emailed myself a timeline because I did not trust losing my phone. There is a moment in some betrayals where crying starts to feel inefficient. The next morning, I drove to Northridge in a clean sweater, with my hair brushed and my grandmother's original church copy in a plastic sleeve on the passenger seat. The church copy mattered because Grandma had followed Gloria's advice. On Tuesday the previous August, after leaving the funeral home, we had stopped by St. Mark's and left an envelope with the church secretary. Mrs. Helen Dobbs, 72, had filed it in the parish office cabinet under P. Helen, was one of those women who always smelled faintly like hand lotion and printer paper. She had known me since I was 12 and still called me honey without condescension. When I called her at 8 the night before, she said, "Come by at 9. I know exactly which drawer." At Northridge, they sat me in a small arrangement room with muted wallpaper and a tissue box placed like an apology. The funeral director on duty was polite but guarded. He said there was a question about the authorization form and, because my mother had alleged fraud, they had to freeze changes until they could verify. I slid the church copy across the table. He looked at it, then at me, then said they needed to compare it to the original file and speak to their records office on Monday because the senior bookkeeper was not in. I asked for a written note that the account was frozen due to an allegation made by my mother. He hesitated. I asked again, calmly. He printed a one-sentence memo. That memo became the first official piece of my case. It had their letterhead, the date, and the words, "Client authorization dispute initiated by daughter Denise Parker." I took it straight to a local attorney recommended by one of my nursing instructors, a probate and elder law attorney named Marcia Keene. Marcia was in her 50s, wore tortoiseshell glasses, and had an office that smelled like old carpet and peppermint tea. She read the memo, read my church copy, then leaned back and said, "You do not need to outshout people like this. You need records." I hired her that afternoon with money from my savings and a check I had originally set aside for board's review classes. My mother escalated before Monday even arrived. On Sunday after church, she told 3 relatives in the fellowship hall that Northridge had found fake signatures tied to me. By Sunday evening, 2 cousins had texted asking what was going on, and one had asked, in the gentlest possible phrasing, whether I was having some kind of breakdown from school stress. My mother also called Pastor Jim and told him there was an ongoing fraud issue and that it would be inappropriate for me to speak at the service until things were sorted out. When institutions are too grand, families use smaller ones. Churches work fine. Helen Dobbs called me that evening, just after 6. Her voice had a papery steadiness to it. She said, "I was in the office this afternoon when your mother came by with Cheryl. She asked if I had kept any copies of old forms. I told her church files are not a buffet." Then she lowered her voice and said, "I watched Cheryl look through the donation basket table while Denise distracted me. They were not grieving, they were hunting. Helen was my named witness long before I knew I would need one. She had seen the original church copy go into the file in August. She had seen my mother trying to retrieve it after Grandma died. There are older women who understand instantly when younger women are being erased. Helen was one of them. Monday morning, Marcia sent a letter to Northridge directing them to preserve the entire file. All call recordings, metadata from emailed forms, and any changes made after March 10th. She also told me to file a police report, not because the police would solve a family funeral mess in 48 hours, but because an accusation of forgery tied to my name needed a time-stamped rebuttal. So I went to the station on South Calhoun Street with my folder of copies, my timeline, and a stomach that felt scraped raw. The fluorescent lights were too bright. A toddler was crying somewhere near the lobby chairs. I gave a calm statement that my mother had falsely accused me of forgery in connection with my grandmother's funeral documents and may have submitted altered records for financial gain. The officer took notes, stamped my copy, and that stamp mattered more than I can explain. That is the first thing people do not understand about stories like this. Vindication rarely begins with a dramatic confrontation. It begins with boring paperwork done on time. That is how long it took them to try to erase me. 48 hours. That is how long it took me to start putting myself back on the record. By Tuesday, the story my mother wanted had already outrun the facts. My phone rang all day with relatives trying to sound neutral while repeating her language. Maybe just let the money go. Funerals make people emotional. Your mother says it was a misunderstanding. A misunderstanding does not generate a county hold and a written freeze on an account. A misunderstanding does not make a pastor remove your eulogy from the program. But what people mean when they say misunderstanding is this: let the person with more social power keep the lie because correcting it will be inconvenient at church. My mother called me just before noon. I put her on speaker and opened my notes app. Her tone was syrupy, which was always more dangerous than shouting. She said, "If you stop making calls, I can smooth this over and still let you have a role at the service." I asked, "Did you tell Northridge I forged Grandma's forms?" She did not answer directly. She said I told them there were concerns because there were. She was elderly, you were always alone with her. I felt that sentence all through my body like a door locking. Then she said, "You have been obsessed with proving you're the good granddaughter. It is embarrassing." I saved the recording because Indiana is a one-party consent state. A fact Marcia had told me with the same calm voice she used to recommend a better stapler. Then I forwarded the file to her office and to a new email folder labeled March 10th onward. If my mother wanted to imply elder manipulation, I wanted every word preserved in the exact tone she used to say it. There is nothing louder than a quiet recording played back at the right time. Tuesday morning was also when Gloria West knocked on my apartment door. It was just after 9. Rain had been tapping at the windows since dawn, and the air in the hallway smelled faintly like wet concrete and someone's toast. I opened the door expecting a package. Instead, I saw Gloria in a beige raincoat holding a plastic document envelope and a folded umbrella. She said, "Exactly as I told you. I brought the original intake sheet, dear." I almost cried then, not because I was vindicated yet, but because an older woman I barely knew had looked at a file and recognized something was wrong. Gloria stepped inside, wiped her shoes on the mat without being asked, and sat at my tiny kitchen table as if she had every right to be there. Her hands were lined and steady. She spread out copies from the funeral home file and pointed with one short, neatly trimmed fingernail. "This," she said, tapping the replacement page my mother had emailed, "is not from our office packet. Wrong revision date, wrong margin spacing, and this signature is traced slowly. See the hesitation on the capital E." Then she slid forward the original intake sheet from August. "I remember your grandmother, sharp as vinegar and twice as clear. She brought lemon candy and corrected me on the spelling of your middle name." I asked how she knew to come to me directly. Gloria said she had not intended to at first. She had flagged the discrepancy internally on Monday and told the funeral director the file needed full review. Then she heard, through staff chatter, that there had already been a family accusation at the visitation planning meeting and that my mother was pressing to be recognized as sole contact before the refund amount was discussed. "That," Gloria said, snapping the clasp shut on her pen, "is when I stopped assuming this was confusion." She looked at me for a long moment and added, "There is a difference between grief and opportunism. I know the smell of both." Marcia nearly smiled when I brought Gloria to her office that afternoon. Nearly. Marcia was not a warm woman in a decorative sense, but she was deeply competent, which I have always found more comforting. Gloria gave a clear statement about the August signing. She described the intake process, the signature card, and the fact that my grandmother had verbally repeated her instructions in front of her. Marcia requested certified copies of the file, the email headers from the replacement page, and the call log showing who first raised forgery. Northridge, now aware that one of their own senior staff had concerns, preserved everything. Institutions can be weaponized against you. They can also become suddenly meticulous when their own liability is involved. My mother escalated again when she realized I was not folding. She texted me a long message saying I was dragging the family through mud for $6,000. She sent a separate one saying, "If the church hears you've involved police, don't expect support." Then Cheryl called my father and had him relay that the family wanted me to stay away from Grandma's house because my presence was upsetting your mother. He left that voicemail at 7:13 in the evening. His voice shook on the word upsetting. He knew by then that something was off. He simply lacked the moral courage to stand up inside his own living room. The visitation was on Wednesday. The service was set for Thursday at St. Mark's. By Wednesday afternoon, Pastor Jim had quietly removed my name from the printed program and replaced my eulogy slot with family reflection. When I arrived at the funeral home that evening, the air inside was heavily conditioned and smelled of lilies, floor polish, and coffee that had sat too long on a hot plate. The carpet muffled footsteps. Soft organ music came through overhead speakers so faintly it felt more imagined than heard. At the entrance to the visitation room, Cheryl touched my elbow and said, with false tenderness, "Maybe don't upset your mother tonight." That was her specialty. She committed cruelty in a hostess voice. Then my mother saw me and said the line this story opened with. She forged a dead woman's name. She said it in front of cousins, church friends, the woman who taught my third grade Sunday school class, and at least two of Grandma's neighbors from the old block. The room went quiet in that stunned, hungry way rooms do when someone gives people permission to be shocked. I could hear the low hum of the refrigerated display from the side hallway. I could smell carnations and furniture polish. I said, "That is a lie." My mother lifted her chin and said, "Northridge knows what you did." She had built a whole stage out of my grief and stepped right into the center of it. The named older woman in that room, besides Gloria, who had not arrived yet, was Helen Dobbs. She was standing near the guest book in a dove gray suit with a brooch shaped like a leaf. She took one decisive step forward and said, "Denise, I was there when Evelyn's church copy was filed in August. You know that." My mother turned to her and replied, "Helen, with respect, you don't know what Lauren has been doing behind the scenes." Helen did not flinch. She pressed her gloved hand on the guest book table and said, "I know a scavenger when I see one." Cheryl looked down at the carpet then, just for a second. It was the first genuine crack I saw in her. I wanted to speak. I wanted to list every document already in Marcia's office. I wanted to pull printed screenshots from my bag and pin them to the wall one by one. But the proxy rule of survival, though I did not call it that then, was already guiding me. I had learned enough in 4 days to understand that if I defended myself in that room, the story would become a fight between a grieving daughter and a difficult granddaughter, so I did not perform. I signed the guest book. I sat in the second row near the side wall. I stayed still and let my mother overplay her hand in public. At one point during the visitation, I walked into the hallway to get air. My quiet support through all of this was my friend Megan Russo, a fellow nursing student with steady brown eyes and a habit of carrying tissues, pens, and granola bars in every pocket of every bag. Megan never told me what to do. She never gave grand speeches about karma. At the visitation, she simply walked over, tucked a bottle of water into my hand, and said, "Drink before you shake." Then she stood beside me in silence while people passed. There is a specific kind of love in not making someone narrate their own emergency. After the visitation ended, Marcia called me from her office, even though it was almost 9. She had received more records from Northridge. The replacement page my mother emailed had been photographed on her own dining room table. The metadata showed the image was created at 8:29 on the morning Grandma died. The original file named me and the church food pantry for any unused balance. The replacement page named my mother alone. Marcia's voice was even. "Lauren, she did not just accuse you. She tried to substitute herself for the refund after asserting the original was forged. We are now beyond family conflict. We are in document fraud territory." I slept maybe 2 hours that night. I lay on top of my comforter in jeans and a sweater, too tired to undress, staring at the water stain near the corner of my ceiling. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard my mother's voice in the visitation room. Somewhere around 3 in the morning, a train horn sounded far off, low and lonesome, and I thought how strange it was that the world can keep moving with such indifference while your own family is trying to staple a lie to your face. This is the part no one prepares you for. The paperwork is practical. The loneliness is physical. Thursday morning, before the funeral service, the pressure campaign started in earnest. My cousin Erica texted, "Please don't make a scene today. Grandma wouldn't want that." My Uncle Dave called to say, "Whatever happened can be sorted out later." Even Pastor Jim, gently and with evident discomfort, suggested that, out of respect for the family's emotional state, I let the matter rest until after burial. I said to each of them some version of the same sentence: "I will not make a scene. I also will not accept a false accusation." It is amazing how often people hear boundaries as aggression when they are accustomed to women absorbing harm quietly. I need to ask you something here, because this was the exact point in the story when I understood how a lone false accusation can make you feel. Have you ever noticed how many people ask for peace only from the person who has already been harmed? Not the liar, not the one who started it, just the one expected to survive it gracefully. By 10:30, St. Mark's smelled like candle wax, old hymnals, damp coats, and the faint metallic scent of spring rain coming off people's umbrellas in the narthex. Light slanted through the stained glass and made patches of blue and red on the wooden pews. I sat 3 rows back on the left with Megan beside me and Helen in front of us, straight-backed as a fence post. My parents sat in the front pew with Cheryl. My father kept rubbing his thumb along the edge of the folded program until it frayed. That tiny repetitive motion told me more than any apology could have. He knew he had walked too far behind my mother, and now did not know how to turn around. The service itself passed in fragments. Psalm readings, a hymn Grandma liked, Pastor Jim speaking carefully about faithfulness, meals delivered in hard seasons, generosity done without display. I wondered whether he understood the irony. My eulogy did not happen. In its place, my mother stood and spoke about our family's devotion and how she had carried the burden of difficult decisions these past few days. A few people nodded. A few did not. Cheryl cried noisily into a tissue. I kept my hands folded in my lap so tightly the knuckles ached. Then, after the benediction, but before people began filing out to the cars for the cemetery, Northridge's funeral director, Brian Haskins, stepped up to the side aisle near the casket. He looked unsettled, like a man who had been handed a situation he would have preferred to avoid in all possible universes. Beside him was Gloria West in her navy cardigan, holding a thick file folder. I did not know they were coming. Marcia had not told me. She had only said late that morning, "You are not to do anything but sit there and breathe." I obeyed. Sometimes wisdom sounds like restraint. Brian cleared his throat and said he needed a brief word before the procession, due to an administrative matter affecting the funeral account and family authorization record. The room paused. There is a peculiar stillness when polite people realize something impolite is about to happen. My mother turned halfway toward him with annoyance already on her face, as if he were interrupting her event. Gloria did not look at me first. She looked at the file. Then she looked at the room. Her voice was not loud, but it carried. Mrs. Evelyn Parker completed her pre-arrangement documents in our office on August 22nd, 2022, in my presence. I verified her identification, witnessed her signature, and filed the originals myself. Paper rustled in her hands. She lifted one page and continued. The original instruction sheet names Lauren Parker as family contact for arrangements and directs any unused prepaid balance to St. Mark's Food Pantry and Lauren Parker in equal parts. A cousin near the back inhaled sharply. Someone dropped a set of car keys into a purse with a hard metallic clack. My mother stepped forward and said, "This is not the time." Brian tried to say something, but Gloria raised one hand without looking at him. It was the smallest gesture, and it stopped the room more effectively than shouting would have. Then she said a separate page was emailed to our office on March 10th, 2023, at 8:36 in the morning, purporting to replace those instructions. That page is not from our office packet. Its formatting is inconsistent with our records, and the signature does not match the original. The request to freeze the file for alleged forgery was made by Denise Parker. She did not say it with drama. She said it the way a weather report states wind speed. That was the outsider reveal. She did not come to defend me emotionally. She came to clarify a file. She had no idea she was delivering the exact verdict my family had denied me all week. And because she spoke as a records woman, not as my advocate, everyone heard it differently, not as a daughter's counterstory, as the plain order of events. My mother opened her mouth, shut it, then said very softly, "I was trying to protect my mother." It was such a poor sentence for such a large lie. Cheryl made a small sound beside her and sat down hard on the front pew. My father half turned toward me, then toward Gloria, then stared at the program in his hands as if words might crawl out and save him. Brian, still looking mortified, added that the funeral home had restored the original instructions, frozen the disputed refund pending legal review, and documented the false forgery allegation in the account. He said all this with professional neutrality, but his ears were red. Helen Dobbs stood up before anyone else could move. She turned, not to me but to the room. "I told you," she said, crisp as pressed linen, "that Evelyn filed a church copy in August." Then she reached into her handbag and with a little triumphant rustle pulled out her own photocopy of the filing receipt from St. Mark's office. She held it up chest high. March 12th, I made a copy before anyone went rummaging. I had not known she had done that. Older women who have seen things know when to duplicate paper. It may be one of civilization's quietest superpowers. My mother did not collapse into theatrics. She did something more revealing. She reached for the file in Gloria's hands as if possession might still become truth. Brian stepped back. Gloria tucked the folder against her side and said, "No, ma'am," 2 small words. "A whole wall." My father whispered, "Denise," and stopped halfway through the second syllable, like the name itself had turned sharp in his mouth. Cheryl covered her face with both hands, but not before I saw genuine horror there, not performative grief, horror. She had helped, I think, with the scavenging and the whispering. I do not believe she knew the document itself was fabricated until that moment. People began to murmur. Quietly at first, then in little ripples. One of Grandma's neighbors shook her head. Pastor Jim looked at the floor as if reconsidering several recent choices. My cousin Erica, who had texted me that morning asking for peace, would not meet my eyes, and I sat still, exactly where Marcia had told me to sit, with my hands unclasping in my lap for the first time in days. That is how long it took for the truth to enter the room. Less than 3 minutes, 4 days of humiliation. 3 minutes of paper. Brian ended it by saying the funeral would proceed according to Evelyn Parker's original wishes. Then he asked, very gently, whether Lauren Parker would still like to give the family reflection if time allowed at the cemetery. I said yes. My voice did not shake. My mother looked at me then with something colder than anger and more desperate than shame. It was the face of a person who has just learned that the institution she tried to steer has logged her name instead. At the cemetery, the ground was damp and soft under the fake grass mat, and the smell of wet soil rose around us in the thin March wind. The sky stayed low and white. I stood beside the casket after the brief graveside prayer and spoke for less than 2 minutes. I talked about Grandma teaching me how to hem a skirt badly but bravely. I talked about her insisting on calling every medical office herself before handing me the phone to translate nonsense. I said she believed practical care was love with its sleeves rolled up. I did not mention my mother. I did not have to. The truth had already done its own work. After the burial, while people were moving toward their cars, Cheryl approached me near the line of vans and sedans streaked with rain. Her mascara had smudged at the corners. She looked smaller somehow, less lacquered, she said. I thought she just wanted control of the funeral. I didn't know she changed the page. It was not an apology so much as a confession made in self-defense. I believed her partly. Not entirely. She had still repeated the lie. She had still rifled through my grandmother's house and tried to help retrieve the church copy, but for one brief second she was not my mother's chorus. She was a woman realizing the floor under her own loyalties was rotten. I said, "You knew enough." Cheryl nodded once. Her mouth trembled, then flattened. Probably. That was her reckoning. Small, inadequate human. Not redemption, just the first honest word she had offered me in years. The resolution did not happen all at once, and I want to be clear about that because tidy endings are often another way of lying. We still had documents to secure. We still had consequences to set in motion. Marcia filed preservation notices with Northridge and obtained the full packet, including the call log, email headers, and image metadata. She also sent formal notice to Allen County Vital Records correcting the forged document allegation and attaching Gloria's statement. The police report remained open. Whether prosecutors would care about one family trying to redirect $6,480 through funeral paperwork was a separate question, but the allegation against me was now documented as false in every place it had landed. Northridge eventually released the unused balance according to Grandma's original instructions. $3,240 went to St. Mark's Food Pantry. The remaining $3,240 came to me by check 3 weeks later, in a white envelope with a return address that made my stomach drop before I even opened it. I used part of it to repay what I had spent on Marcia's retainer. I used part of it for my board's review classes after all. The rest I left alone for a while because touching it felt complicated. Some money arrives carrying a witness stand. My father called 12 days after the funeral. I know the date because I wrote it down. March 27th, 8:17 p.m. rain against the window. Half a bowl of tomato soup cooling beside me on the coffee table. He said I should have asked more questions. That was the closest he came to saying he had stood there while my mother tried to destroy my name over a funeral refund and his own need for domestic peace. I listened. Then I said, "You should have stopped her in the hospital parking lot." Silence. He inhaled as if to respond, then let it out slowly. "I know, we have not had a full repair. Maybe we never will. Some failures are too plain to decorate." My mother did not apologize, not once. She sent one final text through a cousin saying she had been misunderstood in a painful week. I did not reply. Weeks later, when the church council quietly asked for an explanation because rumors were now outrunning her version, she stopped attending the Wednesday women's Bible study for a while. No one told me exactly what was said in those rooms, but I know how small towns and church communities work. People compare notes over casseroles and folding chairs. They remember who said what in hallways. Word spread without my help. That mattered to me more than any dramatic confrontation could have. Community consequence arrived on its own feet. Pastor Jim called and apologized for removing my eulogy from the printed program based on my mother's claims. His voice was thick with embarrassment. He offered to let me speak at the next Memorial Sunday if I wished. I thanked him and declined. Not every repaired bridge needs to be crossed immediately. Helen Dobbs, on the other hand, showed up at my apartment with a loaf of banana bread wrapped in foil and said, "For the record, I prefer my justice warm." Then she sat at my kitchen table, accepted coffee, and told me 3 stories about women in the church who had survived louder men and trickier sisters than anyone knew. She did not pity me. She placed me in a lineage. That was a gift. Gloria West retired that summer. Before she did, she sent me a handwritten note on cream stationery. "Your grandmother knew exactly what she was doing," it read. "Never let anyone call your steadiness selfish simply because it inconveniences them." I keep that note in the same folder as the church copy and the police report. Some people save family recipes. I save proof. Megan stayed exactly who she had been all along. The week my review class started, she drove over with iced coffees, sat cross-legged on my floor amid flashcards and highlighters, and quizzed me on medication interactions while pretending not to notice when I occasionally drifted. At one point, she reached into her bag, pulled out a pack of yellow sticky notes, and covered my fridge with tiny reminders in her blunt handwriting. "Eat, sleep, water, file this later." That is another kind of chosen family. The kind that does not announce itself with speeches. It labels your leftovers and keeps the room from tipping. People often imagine revenge as heat. For me, it was temperature control. It was keeping my voice even in offices where I wanted to scream. It was not lunging for the folder when my mother lied in public. It was understanding that the person who reveals the truth does not always belong to you. Sometimes she belongs to the records room or the church office or the generation above you that has seen enough to know when a younger woman needs a witness more than advice. That is how I won. I built the file. Other people opened it. The most ordinary ending came on a Sunday in late April. The magnolia trees in Fort Wayne were just starting to bloom, and the air had finally lost that bitter edge it carries after winter. I had Megan over. Helen came by after church in her leaf brooch. Marcia actually accepted an invitation and arrived 10 minutes late with store-bought cookies and no apology, which somehow made me like her more. We sat around my tiny dining table with takeout pasta in white cardboard containers and cheap grocery store garlic bread wrapped in foil. Someone laughed so hard at one point that sauce nearly came out her nose. The dishwasher hummed in the background. Outside, a dog barked twice and then stopped. No one asked me to forgive my mother. No one told me to be the bigger person. No one suggested that family is family. We talked about exams, blood pressure cuffs, Helen's ongoing war with the church copier, and the fact that Gloria had apparently once corrected an obituary typo from memory while standing in a rainstorm. Small, ordinary things, chosen things. The kind of evening that reminds you peace is not the same as forgetting. I am not fully at forgiveness. I want to say that plainly. I do not lie to myself about noble endings. There are still moments when I smell lilies and furniture polished together and feel that visitation room close in around my ribs. There are still days when I think about my mother saying, "You were always alone with her," and understand how easily a woman's caregiving can be rewritten as suspicion if someone needs a villain quickly. But I am no longer carrying the burden of proving what happened. The papers carry it now. The witnesses carry it. The town, in its quiet way, carries it. And my grandmother's real instructions were followed. That matters most. The food pantry got its check. I got my name back in writing. The people who chose me sat at my table and passed the bread. Sometimes that is the whole victory. Not applause, not revenge speeches, just the right names on the right papers, and the right people still in the room when the dish